The night Victoria Pell pointed her finger at Colin Rafferty's chest and told him that men like him spent their whole lives opening doors for people like her, the entire lobby of Meridian Plaza went quiet, the way lobbies do when something real is about to happen. Colin didn't move. He stood in his security uniform, navy jacket, faded at the elbows from 4 years of night shifts, and he looked at her with the same expression he used on 1,000 difficult situations before this one. Not hostile, not apologetic, just present. He told her, in the same measured voice he used for everything, that executive suite access on floors 32 through 35 required 48 hours advance notice for after-hours entry. That was the building protocol. He hadn't written it. He was simply the one enforcing it at 11:58 on a Tuesday night. Victoria Pell had not built a $200 million aerospace company by accepting the word protocol from men in navy jackets. She told him his job was to open the door, not interpret policy. She told him that whatever he thought his authority was, she could have it revoked with a single phone call. She turned briefly to Reed Holloway, her chief operating officer, who stood slightly behind her, left shoulder the way a loyal dog stands behind its owner. And she laughed the kind of laugh that was meant to diminish rather than to share. Standing 6 feet away, Colin watched all of it and felt, more than anger, a cold and very specific clarity. A woman this comfortable embarrassing a stranger in an empty lobby on a Tuesday night would make exactly the same kinds of decisions in boardrooms where the consequences fell on people she would never meet. He had already signaled quietly to Terrence Webb, the 23-year-old he had personally trained 3 months ago, to step back and let him handle the desk. Whatever happened next was not going to land on Terrence's record if Colin had anything to say about it. Isaac Dowd walked through the lobby doors at 12:04. He was still in his overcoat, which meant he had come directly from a dinner he had cut short. He took one look at the woman standing in front of Colin, and something shifted in his expression. Not shock exactly, but the particular alarm of a man who has just understood something very bad, very quickly. Victoria looked at Isaac and asked whether this was the attorney who had been making things unnecessarily complicated in the negotiation. Isaac said yes, and then he said the sentence that ended her evening. "Mrs. Pell," he said carefully, "the man you've been speaking to is Colin Rafferty. If you want to watch a woman who has never once been told no, learn what it costs to say it to the wrong person, stay with this story all the way to the end." Colin Rafferty had lived 2 lives simultaneously for the past 4 years, and his 14-year-old daughter, Josie, was the only person who knew both of them well. The first life started every afternoon at 3 o'clock when Josie came home from school, dropped her backpack by the kitchen door, and began narrating her day with the particular energy of a teenager who had been holding her thoughts in all morning and couldn't wait a single additional second. Colin would make whatever they had for dinner, usually something quick, rice and chicken or pasta from a jar, because he was a competent cook but not a creative one, and he would stand at the counter listening to all of it. The bad days and the good ones. The friend who had been cold and the teacher who had finally understood. He listened the same way he did everything else, without interruption, without trying to solve things she hadn't asked him to solve, with the full weight of his attention on her. The second life started at 11 each night, after Josie was asleep and the apartment had gone quiet. That was when Colin sat down at the folding table he had set up in the corner of the room they had converted into an office after Rebecca died, opened his laptop, and worked on StructureScan. The name was functional and a little clunky. Rebecca would have made fun of it, which was one of the reasons he had kept it. StructureScan was an AI-guided aerial inspection system, a coordinated network of compact drones that could survey bridges, dams, transmission towers, and pipeline corridors and detect structural micro-failures invisible to the human eye, long before they became catastrophes. He had started building it during the worst months of Rebecca's illness, Not because he believed it would amount to anything, but because building something precise and demanding was the only thing that kept his mind from folding in on itself during the hours he could not be at the hospital. After she died, it became something else. A thing worth finishing. A thing she would have told him to finish. In exactly the tone she used when she meant it. He had left his position as a senior structural engineer at Harmon Aerospace 3 months after Rebecca's diagnosis, when it became clear that the hours required to stay in that career were incompatible with being the only parent Josie had left. He had taken the security supervisor position at Meridian Plaza because the overnight shift paid reasonably, required genuine competence, and left his mornings free for JoJo's and his afters for sleep. Nobody at the building knew his background. He had not told them because it had not seemed relevant to the work he was actually there to do. By the time companies started calling Rafferty Systems LLC, the entity his attorney Isaac Dowd had incorporated on his behalf, StructuraScan had already done its quiet private job of carrying him and Josie through 4 years neither of them would ever describe as easy. Aerodynamics International had been the most aggressive of the bidders. Victoria Pell had submitted a licensing offer of $90 million. It was the highest number anyone had put forward. Colin had insisted, from the beginning of every negotiation, that his identity stay private until after any final agreement was signed, precisely because he didn't want anyone doing mental math about who he was before the ink was dry. He hadn't known, on the night Victoria walked into Meridian Plaza, that she was the executive he was due to sign with in the morning. He found out when he saw her name on an access request that had come in too late that evening to be processed through proper channels. He said nothing to Maureen Tully, the building's general manager and one of the few people at Meridian he genuinely respected. He simply told her he would handle the front desk himself that night. Victoria Pell arrived in a town car at 11:47 with Reed Holloway and 2 members of her legal team in tow. She walked through the glass doors without looking at any of the lobby staff directly, which Colin had learned was a different kind of rudeness than the obvious sort, not an insult but an erasure. The people around her were furniture until they became inconvenient. She became aware of Colin at the security desk when he spoke to her. He introduced himself by name. He asked for her after-hours credentials. He explained the access protocol for the executive floors with the same brevity and clarity he used for everyone. She looked at him then, the way people look at an object that has unexpectedly spoken. She asked, in a voice calibrated to carry just far enough for her companions to hear, how long he had been working building security. Colin told her. She said something to Reed that turned Terrence Webb, standing quietly behind Colin, into the momentary subject of a joke that had nothing to do with Terrence's actual performance that evening. Terrence had done nothing wrong. Colin repositioned himself slightly, putting his own body between Victoria and the younger guard, and said that access protocols were his responsibility, not his staff's, and that any questions about the after-hours process should come to him directly. Victoria told him she didn't have questions. She had a 9 o'clock meeting on the 33rd floor with an inventor who apparently needed a security guard to explain basic hospitality. Colin said he understood that, and that the access authorization would be processed at 8:30 the following morning, same as scheduled. She took a step closer to the desk. "Do you understand what is being signed in that room tomorrow?" she asked. Colin said he knew the building's meeting schedule. "Then you understand," she said quietly and with great precision, "that nothing you are wearing gives you the authority to inconvenience someone at my level. Men like you spend their whole lives opening doors for people like me. Tonight I am simply asking you to do the one job you actually have." The lobby had gone very still. 2 staff members near the elevator bank had stopped pretending to work. Colin looked at her and told her that he understood exactly what his job was. and that the access credentials were not available before 8:30, and that he would be happy to arrange a waiting area in the lobby if she preferred to stay. Reed Holloway said something under his breath. One of the lawyers smiled. Victoria told Colin to get his supervisor. Colin told her the on-site supervisor was him. She pulled out her phone and told him that by morning his position would not exist. She began to dial. It was at that moment that Isaac Dowd came through the front doors. Isaac had been at a dinner across town when Colin texted him the single word they had agreed upon months earlier as a signal that something had changed in the negotiation timeline. He crossed the lobby quickly, read the situation in the posture of every person standing near the security desk, and understood in roughly 4 seconds what the last 20 minutes had looked like. Victoria looked at him. "You're late," she said. "I'm here," Isaac said. He set his bag on the lobby bench. He looked once at Colin, then turned to Victoria. "Mrs. Pell, I need to introduce you to someone." He said Colin's name, his full name, and then he explained what that name meant. For several seconds, Victoria simply stared at the man behind the security desk. Isaac explained it the way he explained everything, clearly, in sequence, without softening the impact. Colin Rafferty was the founder of Rafferty Systems, LLC. He was the sole inventor of StructuraScan. He was the only individual with the legal authority to execute the licensing agreement scheduled for 9 o'clock the following morning. Reed Holloway said quietly that that was not possible. One of the lawyers opened a folder and looked at the identification photograph inside it. Then she looked at the man standing behind the security desk. Then she looked at the folder again. Victoria's expression went through several versions of itself in a matter of seconds. Disbelief, then calculation, then a composure that snapped into place like armor being fastened. She said the whole situation was clearly some kind of setup designed to extract better terms, and that she was certain they could resolve it like professionals. Colin told her that he hadn't arranged anything. He had worked this building for 4 years, long before Rafferty Systems had any commercial value, and had chosen not to mention his background to anyone at Meridian because it had no bearing on his ability to do his job. He said the thing that bothered him was not what she had said specifically. It was how effortlessly she had said it. The way it had cost her nothing at all. Victoria Pell offered him $15 million above the agreed licensing sum before Isaac had fully unpacked his briefcase. Colin told her he would be in touch through his attorney, signed out of his shift 2 hours early for the first time in 4 years, and walked home through a Chicago November that smelled like lake water and coming rain. By the following afternoon, Aerodynamic's communications team had released a public statement. It described an unreliable inventor who had disrupted a good-faith negotiation process for personal reasons unrelated to the merits of the agreement. It mentioned, with the specific casualness of something meant to wound, that the founder of Rafferty Systems had been employed as a building security guard at the time of negotiation, the implication being that a man whose professional life involved badge access and elevator logs had perhaps overestimated the value of what he had built in his spare time. Several technology trade publications ran the story within hours. Most of them used a photograph of Colin in his uniform, sourced from Meridian Plaza's public website. Maureen Tully arrived at work the following morning to find 3 messages from Aerodynamics' legal department suggesting that her building management company had a conflict of interest in continuing to employ someone involved in an active commercial dispute. She had 2 corporate clients cancel standing facility reservations by end of business that same day. Watching Maureen absorb all of this over the following week, the tightness that settled around her eyes, the way she began arriving earlier and leaving later, as though she could outwork a storm that had nothing to do with the quality of her management, Colin felt a weight he recognized from the years right after Rebecca died. The weight of consequences landing on people who hadn't chosen to be near the blast. It was Josie who first said out loud what Colin had been turning over in silence. She found him at the kitchen table on a Thursday morning with his laptop open, reading something he closed when he heard her come in. She sat across from him with her cereal and looked at him the way 14-year-olds look at parents when they've decided that being careful with you is a form of respect. She asked him whether what he was protecting was worth more than the people getting hurt from simply standing near him. Colin didn't have a simple answer. He sat with the question honestly. What he did next was ask Isaac to formally request a complete copy of Aerodynamics' implementation plan for Structura Scan, a document that had been referenced throughout negotiation but never actually shown to Colin in full. Lydia Marsh, chair of the Aerodynamics board, agreed to provide it as a gesture of good faith during what she described as reconciliation conversations. Colin read the implementation plan at 2 a.m. with Isaac on a video call. Buried in an appendix, one that had not been included in the version shown to Aerodynamics' own board for approval, was Victoria Pell's actual vision for Structura Scan. She intended to use it to eliminate every human infrastructure inspector across her 3 largest client networks within 18 months, replacing them with automated findings that carried no human accountability and no appeals mechanism. She had configured the plan so that any supplier whose infrastructure showed a data discrepancy, regardless of cause or fault, would be automatically locked out of the network until they paid for a third-party audit conducted by a subsidiary she personally controlled. She had quietly stripped every protective clause Colin had specifically negotiated. The mandatory human review requirement, the liability shield for small operators, the 6-month phase-in period designed to give affected workers time to transition, and she had written into page 41 a provision that would transfer the Structura Scan trademark entirely to Aerodynamics' upon signing, removing Colin's name from the invention in every public-facing document going forward. Colin sat with the plan until the sun came up. Isaac stayed on the call. At some point near dawn, Isaac said he was sorry that Colin had had to read this at 2 a.m. in a kitchen in Chicago. Colin said that he was glad he had read it before 9 o'clock the morning before. Victoria escalated in stages, the way people do when escalation has always worked for them. Reed Holloway contacted 2 of Rafferty Systems' early investors privately, suggesting that Colin had destroyed their only realistic path to a return by walking away from the table over what Reed characterized as a personal grievance unrelated to the merits of the deal. One investor called Isaac. 2 others stopped responding to messages and began drafting withdrawal notices. Victoria held a press conference announcing that Aerodynamics had developed its own proprietary inspection platform. She referred to Colin, by name, as a hobbyist inventor who had confused the interest of a major corporation for a validation of his qualifications. Colin's lead engineer, a woman named Dara, who had spent 3 years building Structura Scan's core architecture alongside him, called after watching the press conference and said, without drama, that she still trusted him and that he should tell her what he needed. He asked her to look at something specific inside Aerodynamics' demonstration code, the version they had publicly released as proof of internal development. 2 days later, Dara found it. Embedded in the system's architecture was a structural redundancy pattern that Colin had deliberately written into an early Structura Scan prototype 3 years before Aerodynamics had ever made contact about licensing. It was invisible to anyone not looking for it. He had put it there because he had learned early in his engineering career that intellectual property disputes were much simpler to resolve when you could prove precisely what was yours. The pattern proved that Aerodynamics' platform had been reconstructed from Rafferty Systems' architecture. The question was whether Victoria had known. That question was answered on a Saturday afternoon when a message came through Isaac's secure channel from a sender using an internal aerodynamics address. She identified herself as Dana Wren, a deputy general counsel who had been present at every stage of the negotiation and had not gone to the press. She was not yet willing to testify publicly, but she forwarded one file. It was an audio recording from an internal executive meeting held 3 weeks earlier. The voice on the recording was Victoria Pell's, and it was unmistakable. "Pull what we need from the prototype files. Once he runs out of money fighting us, there won't be anyone left with the resources to take this to court. By then, it'll be ours." The Aerodynamics Board convened an emergency session 12 days after the press conference. Colin arrived in a gray suit he had last worn to a client presentation 3 years earlier. He sat across from Victoria, who was flanked by 3 attorneys and her full executive team. She was watching him the way she had watched him in the lobby, looking for evidence of discomfort, some small thing to use. Isaac presented the evidence in sequence. The hidden appendix with the stripped protective clauses, approved in writing by Victoria. The redundancy signature inside Aerodynamics demonstration code matched precisely against the original prototype file. Access logs showing contractor accounts extracting structural blueprints from Rafferty Systems archive without authorization. The audio recording, and a written statement from Dana Wren, submitted through legal counsel, corroborating the full timeline and confirming that the directive to extract proprietary architecture had come directly and explicitly from Victoria Pell. Victoria said the recording had been altered. She said the contractor had acted on his own initiative. She said the entire dispute was manufactured by a man who had decided that playing the victim was more profitable than negotiating in good faith. Reed Holloway, watching the faces around the table, said that he had raised internal concerns about the approach and had been overruled. Lydia Marsh, chairing the session, looked at each document for a very long time. She asked Colin whether he would consider returning to licensing negotiations under new leadership, with the protective clauses reinstated and an increased offer on the table. Colin told her the question was no longer relevant. He had signed a different agreement that morning. The Bridgewatch Coalition was a network of 43 municipal infrastructure agencies across 11 states, port authorities, bridge inspection divisions, dam monitoring programs, and rural power grid operators. Most of them were chronically underfunded. All of them had infrastructure that Structurascan was built to protect. The coalition had offered $78 million for an exclusive licensing arrangement. The number was lower than Victoria's original offer. Colin had chosen them because the terms they had accepted without negotiation were the ones he had spent 3 years failing to get Aerodynamics to agree to. Mandatory human review of all automated findings, a 12-month transition period for workers whose roles would change, a fully funded retraining program for displaced inspectors, a permanent appeals process for any operator flagged by the system in error, and equity stakes for every engineer who had built Structurascan from the beginning. The room was quiet after he finished explaining. Lydia Marsh looked at the numbers someone placed in front of her. The market position that Structurascan would now represent for a competitor network. The government infrastructure contracts that would flow to the coalition rather than to Aerodynamics, the competitive gap that had just opened between her company and the rest of the field. She looked at all of it. Then she looked at Victoria. The board voted to terminate Victoria's employment for cause, ordering the misappropriation of protected intellectual property, deliberately concealing material risk from her own board, and authorizing a coordinated public campaign against a private individual in order to suppress a legitimate legal dispute. Reed Holloway was placed on immediate administrative leave. Dana Wren was formally thanked for her cooperation and retained. Victoria sat at the boardroom table as the vote was read aloud. She had spent 30 years being the person who determined outcomes in rooms like this one, and she did not appear to have a prepared posture for being the subject of one instead. Before she left, she leaned toward Colin and said, low enough that only he could hear, that he had made the most expensive mistake of his career, and that she would make certain the industry understood what kind of man he was. Colin looked at her and said that she still believed his mistake was walking away from $90 million. He said that this was exactly why she would never fully understand what had happened in the lobby that night. She walked out without responding. In the months that followed, Colin used a portion of the Bridgewatch funding to reimburse Meridian Plaza's management company for the business Maureen Tully had lost during the campaign against him. He granted equity shares to Dara and the two other engineers who had stayed loyal through the worst months of the fight. He established a fund specifically designed to support infrastructure workers whose roles had been automated without any transition plan in place. Maureen offered him a formal role as head of building security, a title, a modest raise, a proper office on the 4th floor. He accepted the title and declined the office. He still worked 2 overnight shifts a week, not to make a point about humility, simply because he had never found the quiet of an empty lobby in the middle of the night to be a place that made him smaller, and he saw no reason to pretend otherwise now. Aerodynamics appointed new leadership. The incoming chief executive issued a public apology to Colin, to Rafferty Systems, and to every member of the coalition workforce that had been named in Aerodynamics' communications campaign. Lydia Marsh later offered $110 million to revisit the Bridgewatch agreement. Colin declined through Isaac without ceremony, saying only that the agreement he had signed wasn't the kind that could be outbid. Victoria Pell faced civil suits from multiple shareholders in the quarter that followed. There was no criminal proceeding and no dramatic public moment of collapse, only the slow, thorough unraveling of a reputation built over decades, coming apart not in a single scene but across many small ones. The way a structure undermined quietly at its base eventually becomes impossible to enter safely. On the first Saturday of December, Meridian Plaza hosted an event for the Bridgewatch Coalition's field teams. Bridge inspectors and dam engineers and grid technicians who had spent their careers doing the kind of unglamorous, essential, invisible work that Structurascan was designed to make safer. Colin was introduced to a room full of people who understood exactly what the invention actually did and why it mattered. Josie came with him. She stood near the back and watched her father talk with people whose names she didn't know about problems she was only beginning to understand. And she looked the way she sometimes looked at things that were finally fitting together into a shape that made sense. Afterward, walking back through a Chicago December that smelled like cold pavement and car exhaust, and somewhere faintly like the lake, Josie slipped her hand through his arm the way she had done as a small girl walking home from school. She asked him whether he had known, that night, in the lobby when Victoria Pell called him a door opener, that everything was eventually going to be all right. Colin thought about it honestly. He told her that he hadn't known, that not knowing was usually just part of the work. She was quiet for nearly a full block. Then she asked him something he hadn't expected. She asked why he still worked the overnight shifts when he didn't have to anymore. He thought about Rebecca, who had spent the last months of her life telling him that the version of himself she loved most was the one who showed up, not for the things that were impressive, but for the things that simply needed doing. He thought about building Structurascan at 2 a.m. on a folding table in an apartment that had felt too large and too quiet for a long time, and how the work had given him a place to put himself when grief left him without one. He told Josie that dignity wasn't something other people handed you based on your title, or your salary, or the size of your office. He told her that a person who worked with genuine care in whatever room they happened to be standing in was never made smaller by the room. She thought about that for most of the walk home. At the corner nearest their building, a car idling at a red light honked at a delivery cyclist who had done nothing wrong. Both of them watched it happen and then kept walking, the way Chicagoans do in winter. "She really thought you'd just apologize," Josie said, in the lobby. "She thought you'd just say you were sorry and let her through." Colin said yes, that was most likely what she had thought. "What were you actually thinking?" Josie asked, right then, before Isaac walked in. Colin considered it. He told her that he had been thinking mostly about Terrence, the young guard he'd stepped in front of, and how the night was going to land on him if someone didn't redirect it. And then he had thought about StructureScan. Whether the woman standing across the desk from him would ever understand what it had been built to protect, and whether she could be trusted with it. The answer to that second question had arrived before Isaac ever walked through the door. He unlocked the apartment. The kitchen still smelled like the soup Josie had left simmering on low, and the whole place had the warmth of a small home in winter that is being taken care of by people who know how. Colin hung his coat. Josie turned off the burner and ladled them each a bowl without being asked. They ate without the television on, which was how they both preferred it, and outside the window the city did what Chicago does in December. It kept going, enormous and indifferent and full of people working late, and people coming home and people whose names no one in power had ever thought to ask. Colin thought, the way he often did in the quiet evenings with his daughter, about how strange it was that the same hands capable of building something worth $90 million were the same hands that had spent 4 years carrying a visitor log and checking elevator access in a building nobody important had ever looked at twice. He decided, as he had decided many times before, and would likely decide many times again, that he would not have traded either version of himself for the other. Both had taught him the same lesson in the end. That your place in this world is never assigned to you by the people who believe they have the authority to assign it. It is only ever the sum of what you choose to do in the moments when no one important is watching.